Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight we are going to talk about Constantine the Great. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whether you're settling in after a long day, drifting off somewhere quiet, or simply looking for a calm moment, I'm grateful that you're here. Your support means more than I can ever say. Every like, every subscription, and every share helps these peaceful stories find new people who might need them. You're the reason the Sleepy Historian continues to grow, and the reason I'm able to keep making these gentle journeys through history. So, thank you, truly. Now, let's begin. In the year 272 of the Common Era, the Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents like a vast tapestry woven from countless threads of culture, language, and tradition. From the misty hills of Britannia in the far northwest to the sun-baked deserts of Syria in the east, from the fertile banks of the Danube in the north to the ancient cities along the North African coast, Rome's dominion encompassed a world of extraordinary diversity. The empire was not a monolithic entity, but rather a complex mosaic of provinces, each with its own character, each contributing its own colors to the grand design of Roman civilization. The cities hummed with commerce and conversation, their forums filled with merchants hawking spices from distant lands, their bathhouses echoing with the laughter and gossip of citizens seeking respite from the day's labors. Along the frontiers, legionaries stood watch over the great rivers and mountain passes, their armor gleaming in the sun, their eyes scanning the horizons for any sign of the barbarian peoples who lived beyond the carefully drawn boundaries of the civilized world. It was into this vast and complicated world that a child was born in the province of Moesia Superior, in a town called Naissus, a settlement that sat nestled among rolling hills and fertile valleys in what would one day be known as the Balkans. Naissus was not one of the great cities of the empire, not a Rome or an Alexandria or an Antioch, but it possessed its own quiet dignity as a military outpost and trading center. The town's streets were lined with buildings constructed in the practical Roman style, their walls of stone and brick, their roofs of terracotta tile that glowed warm orange in the afternoon light. The scent of bread baking in outdoor ovens mixed with the earthy smell of livestock and the sweet fragrance of wild herbs that grew on the hillsides surrounding the settlement. In the central forum, a modest temple to Jupiter stood alongside buildings that housed the local magistrates and tax collectors, while nearby the sounds of hammers on anvils rang out from workshops where blacksmiths and craftsmen plied their trades. The child who entered the world in Naissus on that day in February was given the name Flavius Valerius Constantinus, though history would come to know him simply as Constantine. His father was a man named Constantius, an officer in the Roman army who had distinguished himself through years of faithful service to the empire. Constantius was tall and fair-haired, his appearance reflecting the mixed heritage that was common among the military elite of the frontier provinces. He carried himself with the bearing of a soldier, his posture straight, his manner disciplined, yet those who knew him well spoke of a certain gentleness in his character, a thoughtfulness that set him apart from many of his more brutish contemporaries in the officer corps. Constantius had risen through the ranks not merely through martial prowess, though he was certainly capable in that regard, but through intelligence, administrative skill, and a talent for winning the loyalty of the men who served under his command. Constantine's mother was a woman named Helena, and her story would become as legendary as that of her son, though the truth of her origins remains shrouded in the mists of time and the distortions of later propaganda. Some sources would claim she was a humble innkeeper's daughter, a woman of modest birth who caught the eye of the young officer Constantius during his travels through the provinces. Others suggested she worked in her father's establishment, serving wine and food to the soldiers and travelers who passed through. What seems certain is that Helena was not of aristocratic birth, not descended from the ancient senatorial families that still clung to their privileges and prestige in Rome itself. She was a woman of the provinces, her ancestry perhaps mixed, carrying in her veins the blood of various peoples who had made their homes in the borderlands between the civilized empire and the barbarian world beyond. The relationship between Constantius and Helena was not a formal marriage in the strict legal sense that Roman law prescribed for the highest classes of society. It was instead what the Romans called a concubinage, a stable partnership that carried social recognition but lacked certain legal protections and privileges. This arrangement was common among soldiers and provincial officials, practical men who might form attachments while stationed far from the great cities and the scrutiny of society's upper echelons. Despite the informal nature of their union, all accounts suggest that there was genuine affection between Constantius and Helena, and that young Constantine grew up in a household that, while perhaps lacking in grandeur, was not without warmth and care. The Nisus of Constantine's earliest years was a place where the rhythms of provincial Roman life played out in their timeless patterns. The seasons turned as they always had, each bringing its own character to the landscape and the lives of the people who called this region home. In spring, the hillsides burst into bloom with wildflowers, their colors vivid against the fresh green of new grass, while farmers in the surrounding countryside prepared their fields for planting, guiding oxen pulling wooden plows through soil still damp from winter rains. Summer brought long, warm days when the sun climbed high in a sky of brilliant blue, and the forums and marketplaces buzzed with activity as merchants displayed their wares under canvas awnings that provided precious shade. Autumn painted the leaves of the trees in shades of gold and rust, and the air grew crisp with the promise of approaching winter, while farmers brought in their harvests and prepared for the lean months ahead. Winter itself could be harsh in Moesia, with cold winds sweeping down from the mountains and snow occasionally blanketing the town in white, transforming the familiar streets into a hushed and magical landscape where smoke rose from chimneys and families huddled close to their hearths. In these early years, young Constantine would have experienced the world as children do, with a sense of wonder at the newness of everything, with eyes that saw magic in the ordinary details that adults had long since ceased to notice. He would have played in the streets of Nisus with other children, their games echoing those that children had played for generations, running and laughing with the unself-conscious joy that belongs to the young. He would have watched the soldiers drilling in their practice yards, their movements precise and coordinated, their armor and weapons catching the light, and perhaps he felt the first stirrings of fascination with the military life that his father embodied. He would have accompanied his mother to the market, holding tight to her hand as they navigated through crowds of shoppers and vendors, his senses overwhelmed by the cacophony of voices, bargaining and calling out, by the colors of fruits and vegetables piled high in baskets, by the smell of fresh bread and dried fish and exotic spices from the east. The world of Constantine's childhood was one of contrasts and contradictions, a world balanced precariously between order and chaos, between the civilized comforts of Roman life and the constant threat of upheaval that lurked at the empire's edges. The 3rd century had been a time of tremendous turmoil for Rome, a period that historians would later call the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire had seemed on the verge of complete collapse. Emperors had risen and fallen with bewildering rapidity, many of them military commanders elevated by their troops only to be murdered by those same troops when they failed to deliver the pay or victories that the legions demanded. The frontiers had been breached repeatedly by barbarian invaders, while internal rebellions and economic chaos had torn at the fabric of Roman society. The coinage had been debased as emperors, desperate for funds, had diluted the silver and gold content of their coins, leading to rampant inflation that impoverished many and enriched a few. Plague had swept through the provinces, leaving death and desolation in its wake. Yet even in the midst of this crisis, the essential structures of Roman civilization had proven remarkably resilient. The cities remained, their walls perhaps showing more signs of hasty repair than in earlier, more prosperous times, but still standing, still serving as centers of commerce and culture. The roads that connected the provinces remained passable, maintained by a system of obligations and labor that ensured travelers and merchants and soldiers could move across the empire's vast distances. The law courts continued to function, adjudicating disputes according to legal principles that had been refined over centuries. The Latin language served as a common tongue that allowed a merchant from Gaul to negotiate with a trader from Asia Minor, a senator from Rome to correspond with a governor in Egypt. The civic institutions, the local councils and magistrates, the priests who maintained the temples to the traditional gods, all continued to perform their functions, maintaining continuity even as emperors came and went in distant capitals. By the time of Constantine's birth, the empire had begun to stabilize under a series of capable military emperors who had emerged from the chaos of the mid-century. These were hard men, forged in the crucible of frontier warfare, who understood that Rome's survival depended on military strength and administrative efficiency. They were not philosophers or poets, but soldiers and pragmatists who made difficult decisions with cold calculation. The emperor who ruled when Constantine was born was a man named Aurelian, a brilliant and ruthless commander who had earned the title Restorer of the World through his campaigns to reunite the fractured empire. Aurelian had defeated breakaway regimes in the east and west, had driven back invading barbarian tribes, had begun the construction of new walls around Rome itself as a recognition of the city's vulnerability. The young Constantine, of course, knew nothing of these grand imperial concerns in his earliest years. His world was small and intimate, bounded by the familiar streets of Naissus, by the faces of family and neighbors, by the daily routines of childhood. He learned to speak in the Latin that was the common language of the empire, though he would have heard other languages as well in the cosmopolitan environment of a frontier military town. He began his education, learning his letters and numbers, perhaps under the tutelage of a household slave who served as pedagogue, or perhaps in a small school run by a local teacher who instructed the sons of officers and merchants. He listened to stories, tales of Rome's legendary past, of Romulus and Remus suckled by the she-wolf, of the great heroes who had built the Republic and the Empire, of gods and goddesses who intervened in human affairs from their dwelling place on Mount Olympus. As Constantine grew from infancy into boyhood, his father's career continued to advance. Constantius distinguished himself through his conduct during various military campaigns and administrative assignments, earning the respect of his superiors and the loyalty of his subordinates. The Roman army of this period was a highly structured organization, with clear hierarchies and promotion paths for those who proved their worth. Constantius rose through various officer positions, commanding auxiliary units and then legionary cohorts, gaining experience in the complex arts of military leadership and provincial administration. His reputation spread beyond his immediate circle, and in time he came to the attention of those in the highest levels of imperial power. In the year 284, when Constantine was perhaps 12 years old, the empire underwent a change of rulers that would profoundly affect the boy's future. The emperor Numerian, who had succeeded his father Carus, was found dead under mysterious circumstances during a campaign in the east. His death led to the proclamation of a new emperor, a commander of the imperial bodyguard named Diocles, who took the throne name Diocletian. This Diocletian was a man of extraordinary vision and ability, a native of the province of Dalmatia, who had risen from relatively humble origins to command the respect of the army and the fear of his enemies. He was a pragmatist and an innovator, and he looked upon the empire he had inherited with clear eyes that saw both its strengths and its fundamental weaknesses. Diocletian understood that the empire had grown too large, too complex for any single man to govern effectively from one capital. The challenges facing Rome were too numerous and too diverse. The northern frontiers required constant attention to hold back the Gothic and Germanic tribes who pressed against the Danube and Rhine rivers. The eastern frontier demanded vigilance against the resurgent Persian Empire under its aggressive Sassanid dynasty. The provinces of Egypt and North Africa needed careful management to ensure the grain supplies that fed Rome and the great cities. Gaul and Hispania required secure governance to maintain their prosperity and loyalty. Britain, that distant and fog-shrouded island at the edge of the known world, demanded its own specialized administration. And throughout all these regions, the perennial problems of taxation, corruption, local disputes, and maintaining public order required attention and resources. To address these challenges, Diocletian conceived of a radical new system of governance that would come to be known as the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. Instead of concentrating all power in the hands of a single Augustus, Diocletian decided to divide authority among multiple rulers, each responsible for specific regions and tasks, but all working in coordination for the benefit of the whole empire. Diocletian himself would remain as senior Augustus, ruling from his capital in Nicomedia in the east, while he would appoint a junior Augustus to govern the west. Each Augustus would in turn appoint a Caesar, a junior partner who would assist in governance and be designated as the Augustus's eventual successor. This system, Diocletian believed, would provide the empire with multiple capable rulers simultaneously addressing its various challenges, while also establishing a clear and peaceful mechanism for succession that would eliminate the bloody civil wars that had plagued the 3rd century. In the year 285, Diocletian chose as his co-Augustus a fellow Illyrian officer named Maximian, a man of great military experience and proven loyalty. Maximian was assigned to govern the western provinces, establishing his capital at Mediolanum, which we know today as Milan. A few years later, in 293, the Tetrarchy was completed when Diocletian and Maximian each appointed their Caesars. Diocletian chose a capable officer named Galerius, who would be responsible for the Danubian provinces and the eastern frontier. And Maximian, after careful consideration, selected as his Caesar the officer Constantius, father of our Constantine. The appointment of Constantius to the position of Caesar marked a dramatic change in fortune for Constantine's family. Constantius was now one of the 4 most powerful men in the Roman world, destined, if all went according to plan, to eventually succeed Maximian as Augustus of the West. With this elevation came responsibilities, obligations, and also complications that would shape Constantine's life in profound ways. Constantius was assigned to govern the provinces of Gaul and Britain, regions that had recently been recovered from the control of a breakaway regime that had established itself during the chaos of the 3rd century. His primary capital would be Augusta Treverorum, the city we now know as Trier, situated in the lush valleys of the Moselle River region in what is now Germany. But the elevation of Constantius also required a personal sacrifice that reflected the political calculations of the Tetrarchy. To cement the bonds between the co-rulers and to ensure loyalty through ties of marriage and blood, Diocletian arranged for Constantius to put aside his relationship with Helena and instead marry Theodora, the stepdaughter of Maximian. This was not an unusual practice in the Roman world, where marriages among the elite were often political arrangements designed to create alliances and ensure cooperation. But for young Constantine, now perhaps in his early 20s, this meant a fundamental change in his status and his relationship with his father. He was no longer the recognized heir apparent to Constantius's position and honors. Instead, Constantius would have legitimate children with Theodora, sons who would have a superior claim to succeed their father. Constantine found himself in an ambiguous position, neither fully rejected nor fully embraced by his father's new circumstances. He was sent to the court of Diocletian in the East, officially to serve as a member of the imperial household and to gain experience in governance and military affairs under the guidance of the senior Augustus. But the arrangement also served as a kind of guarantee of his father's continued loyalty. Constantine was, in effect, a hostage, though a well-treated and honored one, whose presence in Diocletian's court ensured that Constantius would not be tempted to rebel or act against the interests of the Tetrarchy. The journey from the familiar landscapes of the Balkans to Diocletian's eastern capital of Nicomedia must have been a momentous experience for the young Constantine. He would have traveled with an escort of soldiers and servants, moving along the great Roman roads that connected the provinces, passing through cities and countryside that revealed the extraordinary diversity of the empire. The roads themselves were marvels of engineering, their surfaces carefully paved with fitted stones, their paths cut through mountains and carried over rivers on arched bridges, their routes marked by milestones that indicated the distances to major cities. Along these roads, a constant traffic flowed in both directions. Merchants led caravans of pack animals laden with goods, their bells chiming as they walked. Military units marched in disciplined columns, their standards raised high, their officers mounted on horseback. Imperial messengers galloped past on the cursus publicus, the state postal system, carrying official dispatches from one end of the empire to the other. Farmers drove carts filled with produce to sell in urban markets. Pilgrims made their way to famous temples and shrines. Slaves shuffled in chains, being transported to new owners in distant provinces. As Constantine traveled eastward, the landscape changed gradually but perceptibly. The forested hills of the Balkans gave way to the broader plains of Thrace. The architecture of the towns and cities began to show more pronounced Eastern influences, with increasing presence of Greek rather than Latin inscriptions, with temples to deities whose worship was more common in the Eastern Mediterranean. The climate grew warmer as the road led toward the coast of the Propontis, the body of water that separated Europe from Asia, and that the Greeks called the Propontis, and later generations would call the Sea of Marmara. Nicomedia itself, when Constantine finally arrived, was a city that embodied the blend of Greek and Roman cultures that characterized the eastern provinces. It sat on the shores of the Propontis, its harbor busy with ships from across the Mediterranean and beyond. The city had been founded centuries earlier by Greek colonists, and it retained much of the character of a Greek polis, with its agora serving as the central marketplace and gathering place, with gymnasiums where young men exercised and trained their bodies, with theaters where performances of ancient Greek dramas still drew appreciative audiences. But Rome had also left its mark on Nicomedia, with forums and basilicas in the Roman style, with bathhouses that could accommodate thousands of bathers daily, with temples to the Roman gods standing alongside shrines to local deities. The streets were paved and lined with covered porticos that provided shade from the summer sun. Public fountains provided fresh water drawn from aqueducts that carried it from distant sources in the hills. The wealthier quarters of the city featured elegant townhouses with interior courtyards decorated with mosaics and fountains, while the poorer districts crowded together in narrower streets where the buildings rose several stories high and life spilled out into the public spaces. Diocletian had chosen Nicomedia as his capital for practical reasons. It was well situated for rapid movement to either the Danube frontier or the eastern frontier with Persia. It had excellent communications by sea with other parts of the empire, and it was far enough from Rome itself to represent a clear break with the traditions of the past, a signal that the empire was entering a new era under new management. Diocletian was transforming the nature of Roman imperial rule, moving away from the fiction that the emperor was merely the first citizen of a republic, and embracing instead an openly autocratic system modeled in part on the ancient monarchies of the East. The emperor was now to be approached with elaborate ceremonies of prostration and hand-kissing. He wore purple robes, heavily embroidered with gold thread and adorned with precious gems. He was surrounded by an elaborate court hierarchy of officials and attendants, each with carefully defined roles and responsibilities. The emperor was becoming something semi-divine, an intermediary between the earthly realm and the gods, a figure whose person was sacred and whose will was law. Constantine entered into this world of imperial pomp and ceremony as a young man in his early 20s, and the experience would profoundly shape his understanding of power, authority, and statecraft. He had come from a military family of the provinces, his origins modest, his early life spent in the relatively simple surroundings of frontier towns. Now he found himself in a setting of almost overwhelming grandeur and complexity. He lived in the imperial palace, a vast complex of buildings that included not only the emperor's private quarters, but also reception halls where foreign ambassadors presented their credentials, administrative offices where the business of empire was conducted, barracks for the palace guard units, workshops where craftsmen produced the luxury goods the court required, and gardens where the emperor and his courtiers could stroll among carefully cultivated plants and trees from across the known world. At Diocletian's court, Constantine received the education of a prince, though without the assurance that he would ever actually rule. He studied rhetoric, learning the art of persuasive speech that was considered essential for anyone who would hold high office. He studied philosophy, reading the works of the great Greek and Roman thinkers, learning the ethical systems and metaphysical speculations that had occupied the minds of educated people for centuries. He studied history, learning the story of Rome's rise from a small city-state in Italy to the ruler of the Mediterranean world and beyond. He studied military strategy and tactics, learning from experienced commanders who shared their knowledge of how to maneuver troops, how to assess terrain, how to understand the strengths and weaknesses of different types of units and different enemies. He learned the intricacies of Roman law, that vast and sophisticated system of legal principles and precedents that governed everything from property rights to family relations to criminal justice. He learned administration, understanding how the empire's tax system functioned, how provinces were governed, how supplies were procured and distributed to the armies. But Constantine's education was not merely academic. He also gained practical military experience, accompanying Diocletian on campaigns and serving in various capacities with the eastern armies. The empire's eastern frontier was a place of constant tension and periodic warfare. Beyond the Roman provinces of Syria and Mesopotamia lay the powerful Sassanid Persian Empire, ruled by shahs who claimed descent from the ancient Achaemenid dynasty that had once threatened Greece itself. The Persians were sophisticated and formidable adversaries, with their own ancient civilization, their own imperial traditions, their own military system built around heavily armored cavalry. The border between Rome and Persia was not a simple line, but rather a complex zone of fortified cities, client kingdoms, and strategic strongpoints, each side constantly maneuvering for advantage, each seeking to extend its influence over the buffer states that lay between the two empires. Constantine participated in campaigns along this frontier, learning the realities of warfare not from books, but from direct experience. He learned what it meant to march with an army through difficult terrain in extreme heat, with water scarce and enemies potentially lurking in every defile. He learned the tedium and discomfort of campaign life, the nights spent sleeping on hard ground, the days spent waiting for something to happen, the constant need for vigilance that wore on men's nerves. He learned how battles were actually fought, the confusion and terror and chaos that characterized combat, the importance of discipline and training in keeping soldiers focused on their tasks even when every instinct screamed at them to run. He learned the cost of warfare in human terms, seeing the wounded and dying, understanding that behind every strategic decision lay consequences measured in blood and suffering. During these years at Diocletian's court, Constantine also had opportunities to observe the emperor himself, to study the man who had taken the empire from the brink of collapse and imposed upon it a new order. Diocletian was, by this time in his 50s, an age considered elderly by the standards of the ancient world, where life expectancies were much shorter than in our own time. But he remained vigorous and active, still capable of leading armies in the field, still maintaining firm control over the vast apparatus of the state. He was not a man given to displays of emotion or personal warmth. His manner was cold and formal, calculated to inspire awe and obedience rather than affection. Yet he possessed an undeniable strength of character and clarity of vision. He made decisions without apparent hesitation, weighing options and choosing courses of action with a confidence that came from years of command. He was meticulous in his attention to detail, involving himself in matters both great and small, always seeking to ensure that his will was carried out precisely as he intended. One of the most consequential aspects of Constantine's time at Diocletian's court was his exposure to the emperor's policy toward Christianity, a policy that would culminate in the last and most severe persecution that the Christian communities would face in the Roman Empire. Christianity had grown dramatically since its origins as a small Jewish sect in first-century Palestine. Despite periodic persecutions, despite their refusal to participate in the traditional religious observances that Romans considered essential to maintaining the favor of the gods and the security of the state, Christians had established communities throughout the empire. They had developed their own sophisticated theology and ecclesiastical organization, with bishops governing local churches, with regular assemblies for worship, with charitable institutions that cared for the poor and sick. Some estimates suggest that by the end of the 3rd century, Christians may have comprised 10% or more of the empire's population, with particularly strong concentrations in certain eastern provinces. For much of his reign, Diocletian had tolerated the Christians, despite his personal devotion to the traditional Roman gods and his deep conservatism regarding religious matters. But in the early 4th century, influenced by his Caesar Galerius, who harbored a visceral hatred of Christianity, Diocletian launched a systematic campaign to suppress the Christian religion. A series of edicts were issued ordering the destruction of Christian churches, the burning of Christian scriptures, the dismissal of Christians from positions in the imperial service, and eventually the arrest and punishment of Christian clergy who refused to offer sacrifice to the traditional gods. What followed was a period of intense suffering for Christian communities, particularly in the eastern provinces where Diocletian and Galerius had direct authority. churches were indeed demolished, their properties confiscated. Christian books were seized and burned. Christians who held positions in the imperial administration or the army were forced to choose between their faith and their careers. Those who refused to comply faced imprisonment, torture, and in some cases execution. Constantine witnessed all of this from his position at the imperial court. He saw the determination with which Diocletian pursued his policy of suppression. He heard the justifications offered by those who supported the persecution, arguments that Christianity was a dangerous superstition that undermined traditional Roman values and threatened the empire's security by angering the gods whose favor Rome depended upon. But he also would have been aware of the Christian communities themselves, of the courage with which many faced persecution, of the testimonies of those who went to their deaths proclaiming their faith. These experiences planted seeds in Constantine's mind. Questions about the nature of divine power, about the relationship between religious belief and political authority, about the possibility that the Christians might be right in their claims, that their God was the true God, and that all the other deities worshipped throughout the empire were false. The years passed, and Constantine matured from a young man into a seasoned officer and courtier. He was now in his 30s, an age when most men had established themselves in their careers and family lives. But Constantine's situation remained uncertain. He was respected for his abilities and his bearing, but he held no independent command, no province of his own to govern. He remained at the Eastern court, his future dependent on factors beyond his control, on the decisions of Diocletian and the other members of the Tetrarchy, on the complicated web of dynastic politics that governed succession in the imperial system. In the West, Constantine's father, Constantius, was proving himself to be a capable and popular ruler. He governed his provinces with a relatively light hand, avoiding the heavy-handed oppression that characterized the rule of some other members of the Tetrarchy. He was particularly noted for his religious tolerance. While officially implementing Diocletian's edicts against the Christians, Constantius did so with minimal enthusiasm, often finding ways to mitigate their harshness in his territories. He focused instead on securing the frontiers of Gaul and Britain, on maintaining order and prosperity in regions that had suffered greatly during the upheavals of the 3rd century. Under his governance, the provinces of the northwest began to recover their vitality, their cities rebuilding, their agricultural production increasing, their trade routes becoming secure once more. In the year 305, Diocletian took a step that was unprecedented in Roman history. He voluntarily abdicated the throne. This extraordinary decision reflected both Diocletian's genuine commitment to the system he had created and also, perhaps, his declining health. He had suffered some kind of serious illness the previous year, and while he had recovered, the experience seems to have convinced him that it was time to implement the succession mechanism that was central to his vision of the Tetrarchy. Diocletian retired to a magnificent palace he had constructed in his native Dalmatia, a vast complex that combined the features of a military fortress with those of a luxury villa, where he would spend his remaining years tending gardens and watching from a distance as others grappled with the challenges of ruling the empire he had stabilized. Diocletian's abdication was supposed to trigger a smooth transition according to the rules of the Tetrarchy. The two Caesars, Constantius and Galerius, would become the new Augusti, and they would in turn appoint new Caesars who would eventually succeed them. Constantius duly became Augustus of the West, and Galerius became Augustus of the East. But the appointments of the new Caesars did not follow the logic that many had expected. Constantius did not appoint Constantine as his Caesar, despite Constantine's experience and abilities, despite the fact that Constantine was his son. Instead, under pressure from Galerius, who had become the dominant voice in the imperial college after Diocletian's retirement, a man named Severus was appointed as Caesar in the West, while Galerius appointed his nephew Maximinus Dia as Caesar in the East. Constantine found himself passed over, his expectations of succession apparently dashed. The reasons for this decision were complex and reflected the political calculations and personal animosities that ran through the imperial court. Galerius distrusted Constantine, perhaps seeing in him a potential rival, perhaps influenced by Constantine's connection to his father Constantius, whom Galerius viewed as too lenient and insufficiently committed to the persecution of Christians. Whatever the reasons, Constantine's position became increasingly uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. He was still at the Eastern court, now under the authority of Galerius, a man who had shown himself capable of considerable cruelty and who had no reason to treat Constantine with favor. It was at this moment that Constantine's father, now the senior Augustus of the West, requested that his son be allowed to join him in Gaul. Constantius was preparing for a campaign in Britain where troubles had erupted that required his personal attention, and he wished to have Constantine by his side. Galerius initially resisted this request, but eventually, perhaps calculating that it was safer to let Constantine go than to risk creating a martyr by harming him, he granted permission for Constantine to depart. The circumstances of Constantine's departure from the Eastern court would later be embroidered with dramatic details, stories of a nighttime flight, of Constantine disabling the horses at the posting stations behind him to prevent pursuit. A narrow escape from assassins sent by Galerius. The truth of these tales is uncertain, but what is clear is that Constantine left Nicomedia in haste and traveled west with all possible speed. The journey across the empire from east to west retraced in reverse the path Constantine had taken years earlier when he first traveled to Diocletian's court. But now Constantine was a man in his 30s, experienced in war and statecraft, his character formed by years of observation and service at the highest levels of power. He traveled through Thrace and across the Danube frontier, through the province of Pannonia with its military camps and fortified towns, through the Alpine passes that led into Italy, through the northern Italian plain, where cities like Aquileia and Mediolanum demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of the western provinces. From Italy, the route led over the Alps again into Gaul, following Roman roads through mountain valleys where snow still capped the highest peaks even in summer, emerging into the rolling hills and fertile valleys that characterized the heart of Gaul. Constantine found his father at Boulogne, the port city on the northern coast of Gaul that served as the primary embarkation point for crossings to Britain. Constantius was preparing to lead an expedition across the narrow strait that separated the continent from the island province that represented the northwestern limit of Roman control. Britain had been a Roman province for 2.5 centuries, ever since the Emperor Claudius had ordered its conquest in the 1st century of the Common Era. But it had always been a challenging territory to govern. The climate was damp and often cold, with frequent rains and mists that seemed alien to Mediterranean sensibilities. Much of the population remained Celtic in culture and language, never fully Romanized despite centuries of imperial rule. The northern reaches of the island were controlled by fierce tribes who had never been conquered, and to contain them, earlier emperors had constructed massive fortifications, including the famous wall built by the Emperor Hadrian that stretched across the island from sea to sea. The reunion between Constantine and his father must have been a moment of deep emotion, though the sources provide little detail about their personal interaction. Constantius was now in his mid-50s and in declining health, his years of military campaigning having taken their toll on his body. But he retained his dignity and his sense of duty, and he was determined to complete the mission to restore order in Britain before his strength failed entirely. Constantine accompanied his father when the army crossed the strait, when the transport ships carried thousands of soldiers across the waters that could be treacherous even in good weather, their hulls riding low with the weight of men and horses and equipment, their sails catching the wind that drove them toward the chalk cliffs of Britain's southern shore. The campaign in Britain proceeded according to plan, with Constantius's forces marching northward, re-establishing imperial control over regions that had fallen into disorder, receiving the submission of tribes that had been causing trouble. But Constantius's health continued to deteriorate, and it became clear that he was seriously ill. The nature of his ailment is not recorded with certainty, though ancient sources sometimes refer to a long-standing condition that had weakened him over time. The army halted at Eboracum, the city we now call York, a major military base in northern Britain that had served for centuries as a key stronghold in Rome's efforts to control the island. It was here, in a building that served as the military headquarters, or perhaps in the palace of the provincial governor, that Constantius took to his bed, too weak to continue. On the 25th day of July in the year 306, Constantius died. He was 56 or 57 years old, and he had served the empire faithfully throughout his adult life, rising from modest origins to hold the highest office the Roman world could offer. He died peacefully, surrounded by his officers and advisors, with his son Constantine by his side. In his final hours, according to later accounts, Constantius expressed his wish that Constantine should succeed him, though whether he had the authority to make such an appointment and whether he actually made such a statement remains a matter of historical debate. What happened next would determine the course of Constantine's life and, ultimately, the course of Roman and European history. The army units that had served under Constantius, the legions and auxiliary cohorts that had followed him to Britain, proclaimed Constantine as the new Augustus. This was not in accordance with the rules of the Tetrarchy, which specified that the sitting Caesar, in this case Severus, should automatically succeed to the position of Augustus when it became vacant, and that the Augustus would then appoint a new Caesar. But the soldiers cared little for such constitutional niceties. They had respected and loved Constantius, and they transferred that loyalty to his son, whom they had come to know during the campaign and whose qualities they had observed. They elevated Constantine on their shields in the ancient Germanic custom that the Roman army had adopted, proclaiming him with shouts and the clash of weapons against armor, their voices echoing through the streets of Eboracum in a moment that linked past and future, tradition and revolution. Constantine, however, showed a shrewdness that would characterize his political approach throughout his life. Rather than claiming the title of Augustus immediately, which would have constituted an open challenge to the established order and invited immediate retaliation from Galerius and the other members of the Tetrarchy, Constantine sent word to Galerius announcing his father's death and requesting confirmation not as Augustus, but as Caesar. This was a carefully calculated move that acknowledged Galerius's authority while establishing Constantine's own claim to a place in the imperial hierarchy. It put Galerius in a difficult position. He could not simply ignore Constantine's claim without risking a civil war with an officer who controlled the legions of Britain and Gaul, some of the finest military units in the empire. After some hesitation and consultation, Galerius agreed to recognize Constantine as Caesar, though not as Augustus. It was a compromise that satisfied no one fully, but avoided immediate conflict. Constantine thus found himself ruling the provinces his father had governed, the lands of Gaul and Britain, and parts of Hispania, a vast territory that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules in the south to the foggy shores of northern Britain. He established his principal residence at Augusta Treverorum at Trier, the city in the Moselle Valley that his father had used as his capital, and that offered an ideal location from which to oversee both the Rhine frontier and the interior of Gaul. Trier was a prosperous city that had grown rich on trade and imperial patronage. Its position on the Moselle River, a tributary of the Great Rhine, made it a natural center of commerce, while its selection as an imperial capital had brought it prestige and resources. The city boasted impressive architecture, including massive baths that could accommodate thousands of bathers, a basilica that served as a throne hall and audience chamber, and a palace complex that demonstrated the wealth and power of the emperors who resided there. The territories Constantine now governed were lands of great diversity and considerable wealth. Gaul was a region of fertile farmlands and prosperous cities, its fields producing grain and grapes, its workshops manufacturing textiles and ceramics and metalwork that were traded throughout the western provinces. The cities of Gaul had recovered from the troubles of the 3rd century and now bustled with activity. Lugdunum, which we know as Lyon, sat at the confluence of the Rhone and Saône rivers and served as a major commercial hub. Burdigala, modern Bordeaux, exported wine to Britain and other northern regions. Narbo, today's Narbonne, connected Gaul with the Mediterranean trade routes. Throughout the countryside, villas belonging to wealthy landowners dotted the landscape, their estates worked by tenant farmers and slaves, producing the agricultural surplus that fed the cities and the armies. Britain, though more remote and less thoroughly Romanized than Gaul, still contributed to the prosperity of Constantine's domains. The island produced wool and grain, metals including tin and lead, and hunting dogs that were prized throughout the empire. Its cities, while smaller than those of Gaul, still featured the amenities of Roman urban life. forums and basilicas, bathhouses and amphitheatres, temples to the Roman gods, alongside shrines to local Celtic deities. The province had its own character, influenced by the Celtic culture that underlay its Roman veneer, by the misty landscapes and ancient stone circles that spoke of pre-Roman times, by its position on the very edge of the known world, where the ocean stretched away westward into unknown distances, and sailors told tales of islands beyond islands, of lands where the sun never set in summer and never rose in winter. Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula, rounded out Constantine's territories. This was a land of dramatic contrasts, from the lush green valleys of the north to the arid plateaus of the interior to the sun-baked Mediterranean coasts of the south and east. Hispania had been Roman for longer than Gaul or Britain, conquered in the wars against Carthage centuries earlier, and its integration into the Roman world was more complete. Its cities included some of the most beautiful and prosperous in the Western Empire. Tarraco, modern Tarragona, served as the capital of the eastern coast. Cordoba, today's Cordoba, was a center of learning and culture. Emerita Augusta, now Merida, featured some of the most spectacular Roman architecture anywhere in the empire. The province exported olive oil and wine and fish sauce, that fermented condiment the Romans called garum, that was produced in factories along the southern coast. As Constantine took up the responsibilities of governing these territories, he faced challenges both immediate and long-term. The frontiers required constant vigilance. Along the Rhine, Germanic tribes pressed against the river boundary, always probing for weaknesses, always ready to cross into Roman territory when opportunity presented itself. These were not unified peoples, but rather a collection of tribes with their own leaders, their own rivalries, their own cultures. But they shared a desire for the wealth that Roman civilization represented, and a warrior culture that glorified martial prowess. Constantine needed to maintain strong military forces along the river, garrisoning the forts and watchtowers that lined the frontier, conducting periodic campaigns across the Rhine to demonstrate Roman power and discourage aggression. In Britain, the northern tribes continued their age-old pattern of raiding and resistance, requiring military expeditions to restore order and remind them of Roman might. Beyond military matters, Constantine faced the administrative challenges of governing a vast territory. The provinces required efficient tax collection to fund the armies and the imperial administration, but excessive taxation could impoverish the population and provoke unrest. The cities needed support to maintain their public buildings and services, but resources were limited and had to be allocated carefully. The roads and bridges required maintenance to keep trade flowing and to allow for rapid military movement when needed. The law courts needed to function fairly to maintain public order and confidence in imperial justice. The imperial postal service, the cursus publicus, needed to operate efficiently to ensure rapid communication between Constantine's capital and the provincial governors and military commanders who reported to him. Constantine also had to navigate the complex political situation created by the continuing existence of the Tetrarchy, even though that system was increasingly showing signs of strain. Galerius, now the senior Augustus, exercised authority in the east, while Severus, the Caesar who had been appointed to succeed Constantius, claimed authority over Italy and Africa. But the neat divisions of power that Diocletian had envisioned were breaking down. In Rome itself, Maxentius, the son of the old Augustus Maximian, who had been Constantius's colleague, refused to accept the authority of Severus and proclaimed himself Augustus, gaining the support of the Praetorian Guard and the urban population. This created a complex situation with multiple claimants to imperial authority, each controlling certain territories, each seeking to expand his power at the expense of the others. Constantine, for the time being, focused on consolidating his position in the territories he controlled and avoided being drawn into the conflicts that were erupting in other parts of the empire. He governed his provinces with the same relatively light touch that his father had employed, earning the loyalty of his subjects through competent administration rather than through fear and oppression. He continued his father's policy of religious tolerance, declining to enforce rigorously the anti-Christian edicts that Diocletian and Galerius had promulgated. This was partly a matter of political calculation. The Christian communities in his territories were significant, and alienating them served no useful purpose. But it may also have reflected Constantine's own evolving views on religious matters, views that had been influenced by his years of observation and reflection. During these years of Constantine's early rule in Gaul and Britain, a transformation was occurring in his thinking about religion, about divine power, about the relationship between earthly authority and heavenly favor. Constantine had been raised in the traditional Roman religious environment, where worship of the Olympian gods and the traditional rituals of sacrifice and divination were simply part of the natural order of things. He had participated in these rituals throughout his life, had offered sacrifices before military campaigns, had consulted auspices to determine favorable days for important undertakings. He had also been exposed to various philosophical and religious currents that circulated throughout the empire. The educated classes of the Roman world were increasingly attracted to forms of monotheism or henotheism, belief systems that posited a single supreme divine power that stood above the traditional pantheon of gods and goddesses. The cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, had gained considerable popularity in the late 3rd century, particularly among the military. This was a solar monotheism that identified the sun as the supreme manifestation of divine power, with other gods understood as subsidiary powers or different names for the same underlying reality. Constantine's father, Constantius, appears to have been devoted to Sol Invictus, and Constantine himself honored the sun god, having coins minted that showed the solar deity on their reverse sides. This solar monotheism offered a way to maintain traditional Roman religious observances, while also moving toward a more philosophically sophisticated conception of divinity as a unified power rather than a collection of competing deities. But Constantine was also increasingly aware of Christianity as a religious force that could not be dismissed or ignored. Despite periodic persecutions, despite the disadvantages Christians faced in terms of career advancement and social status, despite the contempt with which the traditional Roman elite viewed Christian beliefs as superstitious and absurd, the Christian communities continued to grow and to demonstrate remarkable resilience. Constantine had seen this firsthand during his years at Diocletian's court, when even the full power of the imperial state had failed to suppress Christian worship. He had also observed that Christians could be loyal and capable servants of the empire when given the opportunity. His father's territories had included significant Christian populations, and they had caused no problems for Constantius's administration. According to the accounts that would later be written by Christian historians, particularly by Eusebius, Bishop of Caesarea, who would become Constantine's confidant and admirer, Constantine experienced a religious vision or revelation that profoundly affected his spiritual orientation. The exact timing and nature of this experience is reported variously in different sources, and historians continue to debate the details. But the essential story is this. At some point, either shortly before or during a crucial military campaign, Constantine became convinced that the Christian God had shown him a sign, had promised him victory if he would fight under the banner of Christ rather than under the traditional Roman standards. Some accounts place this experience in Gaul during Constantine's early years of rule there. Others associate it more specifically with the events leading up to Constantine's eventual confrontation with Maxentius, the rival emperor who controlled Rome and Italy. What seems clear is that Constantine came to believe, whether through a dream or a waking vision or through a gradual process of reflection and decision, that the Christian God was the supreme divine power, and that by honoring this God, Constantine would receive the protection and support necessary to overcome his enemies and achieve greatness. The description of the vision, as recounted by Eusebius, is vivid and specific. Constantine reportedly saw in the sky above the sun a cross of light, and with it words that can be translated as "by this sign, conquer," or "in this sign, conquer." That night, according to the account, Christ appeared to Constantine in a dream, showing him the same sign and instructing him to use it as a safeguard in his military engagements. Constantine ordered his craftsmen to create a new military standard, a combination of the traditional Roman vexillum with Christian symbols. This standard, which came to be called the labarum, featured the chi rho symbol, formed by superimposing the first two letters of the Greek word for Christ, Christos. Whether the vision occurred exactly as described, whether it was a genuine supernatural experience or a psychological phenomenon or a later literary invention designed to portray Constantine's conversion in dramatic terms, the reality is that Constantine made a decision at some point to align himself with Christianity. This was an extraordinary and risky choice. No Roman emperor had ever before given official favor to Christianity. The traditional gods and their worship were thoroughly intertwined with every aspect of Roman public life, from the taking of oaths to the opening of Senate meetings to the celebration of military victories. The emperors themselves were expected to serve as chief priests of the traditional religion, performing sacrifices and maintaining the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods that ensured divine favor for Rome. For Constantine to break with this tradition, to suggest that the Christian God, rather than Jupiter and the Olympian deities, was the source of imperial power, was revolutionary. But Constantine was a practical man as well as an ambitious one, and he understood that religious conviction could be a powerful political tool. If he could unite the Christian communities behind him, if he could position himself as their protector and champion, he would gain the loyalty of a significant portion of the empire's population, people who had every reason to feel alienated from the imperial system that had persecuted them. At the same time, Constantine was careful not to alienate completely those who adhered to the traditional religions. His coins continued for years to feature images of Sol Invictus. His public statements about religion often used language that could be interpreted in ways compatible with both Christian and traditional beliefs, speaking of a supreme divinity without always specifying exactly which theological system he had in mind. In the year 312, 6 years after Constantine's acclamation as Caesar by the army in Britain, the complex political situation in the empire moved toward a crisis that would require Constantine to take decisive action. Maxentius, who controlled Rome and Italy and who styled himself as Augustus, despite not being recognized as such by the other members of the Tetrarchy, had proven to be an increasingly problematic ruler. His government was oppressive and extractive, imposing heavy taxation on Italy and Africa to support his military forces and his building projects. He had alienated much of the Roman Senate and people through his arbitrary actions and apparent corruption. At the same time, he represented a threat to Constantine's position, controlling as he did the heartland of the empire and potentially able to launch campaigns northward into Gaul. Constantine made the decision to march on Italy, to confront Maxentius and remove him from power. This was a gamble of immense proportions. Constantine would be invading the Italian peninsula with forces that were smaller than those Maxentius commanded. He would be leaving his own territories in Gaul and Britain relatively undefended. He would be challenging a rival who held strong defensive positions, including the formidable walls of Rome itself. If Constantine failed, he would likely lose everything, including his life. The army that Constantine led into Italy in the spring of 312 was composed of seasoned units from Gaul and Britain, soldiers who had proven themselves in campaigns along the Rhine and in the north. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and loyal to their commander. Constantine led them over the Alpine passes, following the routes that countless Roman armies had taken before them, routes that Hannibal had famously traversed centuries earlier in the opposite direction during his war against Rome. The passes were still partially snow-covered, the air thin and cold, the paths narrow and treacherous, but the army made its way through, emerging onto the northern Italian plain, where the first signs of spring were beginning to show in the budding trees and the greening fields. The campaign that followed was a series of engagements as Constantine moved southward through northern Italy, confronting and defeating the forces Maxentius sent to stop him. Cities opened their gates to Constantine or were taken after brief sieges. Constantine's soldiers, though outnumbered, fought with discipline and determination, their confidence bolstered by their commander's leadership and by their belief that their cause was just. Constantine himself demonstrated the personal courage expected of a Roman general, leading from the front when necessary, sharing the hardships of the campaign with his men, making strategic decisions with a combination of boldness and calculation that brought success. As Constantine's army approached Rome itself, Maxentius faced a difficult decision. He could remain within the formidable defenses of the Aurelian walls, the massive fortifications that encircled Rome, and wait for Constantine to exhaust himself in a siege that might last months or even years. Or he could march out and give battle in the open field, attempting to use his numerical superiority to crush Constantine's army decisively. Against the advice of many of his counselors, Maxentius chose to fight. Perhaps he was confident in his larger forces. Perhaps he feared that remaining in the city would make him appear cowardly. Perhaps he believed that the gods favored him, for he had consulted the traditional Roman methods of divination and received omens that he interpreted as promising. The two armies met just outside Rome, near the Tiber River, at a place where the ancient Milvian bridge carried the Flaminian Way across the water. It was the 28th day of October in the year 312, and the armies drew up in battle formation in the fields on the northern bank of the river. Maxentius had crossed the bridge with his forces, leaving the city behind, committing himself to the battle. Constantine's army, smaller but perhaps more cohesive and better led, prepared to receive them. Before the battle commenced, Constantine had his soldiers mark their shields with the Christian symbol he had adopted, the Chi Rho that had appeared in his vision. This was an extraordinary step, a public declaration that Constantine was placing his fate and the fate of his army in the hands of the Christian God. Whatever skepticism his pagan soldiers might have felt about this new religious symbolism was outweighed by their confidence in Constantine himself and their desire for the rewards that victory would bring. The battle itself, like most ancient battles, was probably a confused and brutal affair. Thousands of men clashing in close combat, the air filled with the shouts of soldiers and the clash of weapons, with the screams of wounded men and horses, with the smell of blood and sweat and fear. But battles were decided not just by the courage or skill of individual soldiers, but by leadership, by tactics, by morale, and by circumstances that could seem like providence or luck. Constantine's forces pressed forward with determination, their discipline holding even in the chaos of combat. Maxentius's forces, despite their greater numbers, began to waver. The exact sequence of events is difficult to reconstruct from the ancient sources, which offer varying accounts. But what is clear is that at some point Maxentius's line broke. His soldiers began to flee back toward the safety of the city, and in the panic and confusion, Maxentius himself was killed. Some accounts say he drowned in the Tiber when the makeshift bridge his engineers had constructed collapsed under the weight of his fleeing soldiers. His body was later recovered from the river, and his head was cut off and displayed in Rome as proof of Constantine's victory. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge was one of the most consequential engagements in Roman history. Constantine had gambled and won. Maxentius was dead, his forces scattered or surrendered. Rome opened its gates to Constantine, and he entered the ancient city in triumph, though he declined the traditional ceremony that would have involved ascending to the Capitoline Hill and offering sacrifice to Jupiter. Instead, Constantine presented himself as a liberator who had freed Rome from a tyrant. The Senate gratefully confirmed his authority, erecting an arch in his honor, the Great Arch of Constantine that still stands near the Colosseum, decorated with reliefs and inscriptions celebrating his victory. Constantine now controlled the western half of the Roman Empire, from Britain to North Africa. He was the undisputed master of the West, and while technically there were still other Augusti and Caesars in the tetrarchal system, Constantine's victory had fundamentally altered the balance of power. The old system that Diocletian had created was effectively dead, replaced by a new reality in which powerful military leaders controlled different parts of the empire and maneuvered against each other for ultimate supremacy. But Constantine did not immediately move to eliminate his remaining rivals. Instead, he spent the next several years consolidating his control of the western provinces, addressing the administrative and economic challenges that had accumulated during the years of division and conflict, and carefully building the foundations for future expansion. One of his most significant acts during this period was the promulgation, together with Licinius, who controlled the Balkans and parts of the East, of what has come to be known as the Edict of Milan in 313. This was not actually a single formal edict, but rather a policy of religious toleration that was implemented across the territories controlled by Constantine and Licinius. The Edict of Milan represented a fundamental shift in imperial religious policy. Instead of continuing the persecution of Christians that Diocletian and Galerius had pursued, Constantine and Licinius granted Christians complete freedom to practice their religion openly. Christian property that had been confiscated during the persecutions was to be returned. Christians who had lost positions in imperial service because of their faith were to be reinstated. Churches that had been destroyed could be rebuilt. Christian clergy were granted certain privileges and exemptions. The edict also affirmed religious freedom for all inhabitants of the empire, allowing people to follow whatever religious practices they chose without interference from the state. This policy of toleration was motivated by a complex mixture of religious conviction, political calculation, and practical necessity. Constantine appears to have been genuinely convinced that the Christian God had granted him victory over Maxentius, and that he owed that God gratitude and honor. He also recognized that Christians represented a significant and growing portion of the empire's population, particularly in the East, and that winning their loyalty would strengthen his political position. Practically, the persecutions had failed to eliminate Christianity, and had only generated martyrs whose courage inspired more conversions. Toleration was simply a more effective policy than continued suppression. The impact of the Edict of Milan on the Christian communities throughout the empire was profound. After decades of intermittent persecution, after years of existing in a state of legal uncertainty, after watching their churches demolished and their scriptures burned, after seeing their fellow believers imprisoned and executed, Christians could now worship openly without fear. Churches began to be built or rebuilt throughout the empire, not hidden away, but standing prominently in cities, their architecture beginning to develop the distinctive forms that would characterize Christian basilicas. Christian bishops became increasingly visible and influential figures, consulted by imperial officials, granted authority to adjudicate certain legal disputes, their opinions sought on matters of policy. Constantine himself became increasingly involved in Christian affairs, viewing himself as having a responsibility to support the Church and ensure its unity and proper functioning. This involvement would lead him into the complex and often acrimonious theological disputes that characterized early Christianity, disputes about the nature of Christ, about the relationship between the Father and the Son, about questions of church organization and discipline. Constantine discovered that Christians, despite sharing a common faith, were deeply divided on many issues, and that these divisions could be as intense and bitter as any political conflict. One of the first major controversies Constantine faced was the Donatist dispute in North Africa. This conflict arose from disagreements about how to treat Christians who had weakened during the persecutions, who had handed over scriptures to be burned, or had offered sacrifice to the pagan gods to save their lives. Some Christians argued that these traditores, as they were called, those who had handed things over, should be permanently excluded from the church, and that any clergy who had betrayed the faith in this way could not validly perform sacraments. Others advocated for a more lenient approach, arguing that the church should welcome back those who repented of their weakness. The dispute became particularly intense in North Africa, where a rigorist faction refused to recognize the authority of bishops they deemed too lenient, creating a schism that divided the Christian community. Constantine attempted to resolve the Donatist controversy by calling councils of bishops and issuing rulings based on their recommendations, but his efforts met with limited success. The Donatists refused to accept decisions that went against them, and the conflict continued for decades, demonstrating the limits of imperial authority in matters of religious doctrine and practice. But Constantine's involvement established a precedent that would have lasting significance. The emperor was positioning himself as a kind of external bishop, as he would later describe his role, responsible for the external well-being of the church, even if he did not claim the authority to define doctrine or perform sacramental functions. During these years, Constantine was also engaged in building projects that would transform the physical landscape of the empire and create visible monuments to his power and his religious commitments. In Rome itself, despite his unease with the traditional pagan character of the ancient city, Constantine sponsored the construction of several major Christian basilicas. The first and most significant was the basilica built over what was believed to be the tomb of the Apostle Peter on the Vatican Hill, an area that had previously been a cemetery and site of Nero's circus. This enormous church, which would stand for over 1,000 years before being replaced by the Renaissance basilica that stands today, established a new model for Christian architecture, adapting the Roman basilica form to serve the needs of Christian worship. Constantine also built the Basilica of St. John Lateran, which became the seat of the Bishop of Rome, and other churches throughout the city. These building projects served multiple purposes. They demonstrated Constantine's piety and his commitment to Christianity. They provided impressive spaces for Christian worship and assembly. They also helped to transform the religious character of Rome itself, creating a Christian sacred landscape alongside the ancient pagan temples and shrines. The construction of these churches required enormous resources, vast quantities of marble and precious metals, the labor of thousands of workers and craftsmen, the skills of architects and mosaicists and sculptors. Constantine financed these projects through the imperial treasury, which was filled by taxation and by the confiscation of treasures from pagan temples, a practice that Constantine increasingly employed to fund his Christian building projects. But Constantine's attention wasn't focused solely on Rome. Indeed, he spent relatively little time at the ancient capital, preferring to govern from cities that were closer to the frontiers where military threats required his attention. He resided frequently in Trier, in Sirmium on the Danube, in other strategic cities that allowed him to respond quickly to crises and to maintain close contact with the armies that were the ultimate foundation of his power. Constantine understood that the empire's center of gravity had shifted eastward, that the most pressing challenges, both military and economic, lay in the eastern provinces with their greater populations and wealth, their proximity to the Persian frontier, their role in the complex web of Mediterranean trade. The relationship between Constantine and Licinius, who controlled much of the east, gradually deteriorated during the years following their initial cooperation. The two men had briefly been brothers-in-law, for Licinius had married Constantine's half-sister, Constantia, as part of the political arrangements, following the Battle of Milvian Bridge. But the alliance was one of convenience rather than trust, and as both men consolidated their positions, they increasingly came into conflict. The tensions erupted into open warfare in 316, when Constantine and Licinius fought a series of battles in the Balkans. Constantine emerged victorious from these encounters, but rather than completely destroying Licinius, he agreed to a peace settlement that left Licinius in control of the eastern provinces, while Constantine expanded his own territories to include most of the Balkans. For nearly a decade, an uneasy peace prevailed between the two Augusti. But the relationship continued to deteriorate, complicated by religious differences. For while Constantine had become an open supporter of Christianity, Licinius remained committed to the traditional pagan cults and grew increasingly suspicious of Christians in his territories, seeing them as potential fifth columnists loyal to Constantine. By 324, the two rulers were on a collision course that could only end with one of them supreme over the entire empire. The final confrontation came in the summer of 324. Constantine invaded Licinius's territories with a large army, while simultaneously his son Crispus commanded a fleet that engaged Licinius's naval forces in the straits near Byzantium. The campaign was decisive. Constantine defeated Licinius's armies in battle at Adrianople and again at Chrysopolis, across the straits from Byzantium. Licinius, his forces shattered and his options exhausted, surrendered to Constantine, pleading for mercy. Constantine initially spared his life, sending him into retirement at Thessalonica, but eventually, suspecting ongoing conspiracies, had him executed. With Licinius's death, Constantine stood alone as sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire, the first emperor to hold such complete authority since the establishment of the Tetrarchy decades earlier. Now, master of the Roman world, from Britain to Egypt, from the Atlantic to Mesopotamia, Constantine faced the challenge of governing this vast domain and of implementing his vision for the empire's future. He was in his 50s now, a mature man with decades of military and administrative experience, a ruler who had proven his abilities on battlefields and in the complex negotiations of imperial politics. He possessed the confidence that came from success, but also, if ancient accounts are to be believed, a growing sense of his own divine mission, a belief that he had been chosen by God to guide the empire and to establish Christianity as its dominant religion. One of the most consequential decisions of Constantine's reign was his choice to found a new capital city in the east, a city that would bear his name and serve as a Christian counterpart to pagan Rome. The location he selected was the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, situated on a peninsula jutting into the key Bosphorus, the narrow strait that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, the waterway that divided Europe from Asia. This site had obvious strategic advantages. It commanded the sea routes between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. It was well positioned to allow rapid movement of forces to either the Danube frontier or the eastern frontier with Persia. It was supplied with fresh water from aqueducts that could bring water from sources in the surrounding hills. The peninsula on which it sat could be easily fortified, with water on 3 sides providing natural defenses. But the choice of this location also had symbolic significance. Constantine was creating a new Rome, a city that would, from its very beginning, be a Christian city, untainted by centuries of pagan tradition and worship. This would be a capital worthy of the new era that Constantine believed he was inaugurating, an era in which Christianity would be not a persecuted minority, but the favored religion of the empire, in which the church would work in partnership with the imperial state to bring about God's purposes on earth. The construction of Constantinople, as the new city was officially named, began in 324 and proceeded with extraordinary speed, driven by Constantine's determination to see the project completed during his lifetime, and by the enormous resources he mobilized for the task. Workers and craftsmen were brought from throughout the empire, thousands upon thousands of men laboring to transform the relatively modest city of Byzantium into a metropolis worthy of serving as an imperial capital. Ships carried building materials from distant quarries, marble from Greece and Asia Minor, granite from Egypt, precious stones and metals from various provinces. Sculptors and mosaicists, architects and engineers arrived to apply their skills to the emperor's grand design. The city that rose on the peninsula over the course of several years was laid out on a grand scale, though smaller than Rome itself in its initial conception. A massive land wall closed off the peninsula from the west, punctuated by gates that provided access to the roads leading into the interior of Thrace. Along the seaward sides, walls and fortifications protected the harbors and shores from naval attack. Within these defenses, the city was organized along the lines of a traditional Roman city, but with distinctively Christian elements. A great forum, the Forum of Constantine, served as a central gathering place. At its center, a tall porphyry column topped by a statue of Constantine himself, portrayed in the guise of Apollo, though Christian interpretation later assimilated such imagery to a Christian framework. From this forum, a great colonnaded street, the Mese or Middle Street, ran westward through the city, lined with shops and public buildings. Constantine constructed a great palace complex on the southeastern tip of the peninsula, overlooking the Sea of Marmara and commanding views across to the hills of Asia on the opposite shore. This palace would be expanded and elaborated by Constantine's successors over the following centuries, eventually becoming a vast labyrinth of buildings, courtyards and gardens that served not only as the emperor's residence, but as the administrative center of the empire. Adjacent to the palace, Constantine built a hippodrome for chariot races and public spectacles, recognizing that emperors needed to provide entertainment for the urban population, that the crowds gathering in the hippodrome represented a political force that needed to be carefully managed through a combination of spectacle and largesse. Most significantly for the character of the new capital, Constantine filled Constantinople with Christian churches rather than pagan temples. The Church of the Holy Apostles was built to serve as an imperial mausoleum, where Constantine intended to be buried, surrounded by memorials to the 12 apostles. The Church of Hagia Irene, dedicated to holy peace, served as one of the principal congregational churches of the city. Other churches were scattered throughout the urban fabric, their architectural forms developing the basilica style that Constantine had pioneered in Rome, their interiors decorated with marble revetments and mosaic icons that depicted scenes from Scripture and portrayed Christ and the saints in shimmering gold and brilliant colors. Constantine also brought to his new capital treasures and artworks from throughout the empire, sometimes stripping them from pagan temples in what might be seen as both cultural appropriation and deliberate desacralization of pagan holy sites. Statues of gods and goddesses, relieved of their religious context, were displayed in public spaces in Constantinople as works of art and as demonstrations of the emperor's power to command the resources and treasures of the entire known world. The Serpent Column from Delphi, an ancient bronze monument commemorating the Greek victory over the Persians at Plataea nearly 900 years earlier, was transported to Constantinople and erected in the Hippodrome, where it can still be seen today, battered and incomplete, but still standing as a silent witness to the layers of history that accumulated in this city. The dedication of Constantinople took place on the 11th of May in the year 330, with elaborate ceremonies that combined Christian and traditional elements in ways that reflected Constantine's ongoing negotiation between the religious heritage of the past and the Christian future he was trying to create. The city was placed under the protection of the Virgin Mary rather than under traditional patron deities, establishing from the beginning its identity as a Christian capital. But the ceremonies also included elements familiar from traditional Roman practice, processions and games and distributions of largesse to the populace, the time-honored ways in which Roman emperors displayed their generosity and secured the loyalty of urban populations. With Constantinople established as his new capital, Constantine turned his attention to the continuing challenges of governance and to his efforts to support and guide the Christian Church. It was during this period that he became involved in what would prove to be one of the most consequential theological controversies in Christian history. The Arian dispute that threatened to tear the Church apart, and that required Constantine to exercise his authority in an attempt to restore unity. The controversy centered on questions about the nature of Christ and his relationship to God the Father. A presbyter in Alexandria named Arius had been teaching that Christ the Son was not co-eternal with God the Father, that there was a time when the Son did not exist, that the Son was the first and greatest of God's creations, but was nonetheless a created being rather than fully divine in the same sense as the Father. This teaching was condemned by Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria, who insisted that the Son was of the same substance as the Father, co-eternal and fully divine, not created but begotten before all ages. The dispute rapidly spread beyond Alexandria, with bishops and theologians throughout the East taking sides, the controversy generating intense passions and bitter rhetoric, with accusations of heresy flying in both directions. Constantine, genuinely troubled by the divisions this controversy was creating within the church he had labored to support and protect, made the decision to call a council of bishops to resolve the matter. This council met in the year 325 in the city of Nicaea, located in Bithynia in Asia Minor, not far from Nicomedia, where Constantine had spent his years at Diocletian's court. The Council of Nicaea was the first ecumenical council, the first time that bishops from throughout the entire Christian world had gathered together to deliberate on matters of faith and practice. Constantine himself presided over the opening of the council, addressing the assembled bishops and urging them to reach agreement for the sake of church unity. The council, after much debate and discussion, produced what has come to be known as the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith that affirmed the full divinity of Christ, declaring him to be of the same substance as the Father, begotten, not made, and thus rejecting the central claims of Arius. The creed was signed by the vast majority of bishops present, though a small number who refused to sign were sent into exile. Constantine gave his imperial approval to the council's decisions, lending the authority of the state to the theological conclusions the bishops had reached, and directing that the Nicene faith should be upheld throughout the empire. The Council of Nicaea represented a significant moment in the relationship between church and state, establishing a precedent for imperial involvement in theological disputes and for the calling of councils to resolve such disputes with imperial backing. It also marked a significant development in Christian theology itself, as the Church moved toward more precise and philosophically sophisticated formulations of its doctrines. But the Council did not actually end the Arian controversy, which would continue for decades, with various factions promoting different theological positions and emperors taking different sides. The unity Constantine sought remained elusive, but his involvement established patterns that would shape the relationship between Christian emperors and the Christian Church for centuries to come. As Constantine entered the final decade of his life, his rule took on an increasingly troubled character. The successes of his early years, the military victories, the unification of the empire, the establishment of Constantinople, began to be overshadowed by problems within his own family and by decisions that would stain his reputation. Constantine had several sons by his second wife Fausta, whom he had married after setting aside his first wife Minervina, mother of his eldest son Crispus. The relationships within this blended family were complicated and apparently poisoned by jealousies and suspicions. In 326, a series of events occurred that remain mysterious in their details, but terrible in their consequences. Constantine ordered the execution of his eldest son, Crispus, who had served him ably as a military commander, and who, by all accounts, was a capable and popular prince. Shortly afterward, Constantine's wife, Fausta, also died under suspicious circumstances, with some sources suggesting that Constantine had her killed as well. The reasons for these deaths remain unclear, despite centuries of historical speculation. Some ancient sources hint at accusations of an illicit relationship between Crispus and Fausta, though whether such accusations had any basis in reality or were inventions designed to justify murders committed for political reasons cannot now be determined. What is clear is that Constantine, in his paranoia or rage or whatever motivated his actions, destroyed his own family in a manner that recalls the worst excesses of earlier emperors. These domestic tragedies didn't prevent Constantine from continuing to govern the empire and to pursue his religious and political objectives. He continued his building projects, not only in Constantinople, but in other cities as well. He sponsored the construction of churches in the Holy Land, at sites associated with the life and death of Christ, including the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, built on what was believed to be the site of Christ's crucifixion and tomb. Constantine's mother, Helena, who had remained a significant figure in his life, despite the early dissolution of her relationship with Constantine's father, traveled to Palestine in her old age and became associated with the discovery of what were claimed to be relics of the true cross, the actual cross on which Christ had been crucified. Whether or not these relics were authentic, they became objects of enormous veneration and helped to establish Jerusalem and the Holy Land as major centers of Christian pilgrimage. Constantine also continued his administrative and military activities. He reformed the coinage, establishing a new gold coin called the solidus that became the standard currency of the Mediterranean world for centuries. He restructured the imperial administration, separating civil and military authorities to prevent any single official from accumulating too much power, establishing a more elaborate bureaucracy with specialized departments for different aspects of governance. He maintained the empire's defenses, campaigning when necessary against barbarian threats, keeping the legions equipped and ready, ensuring that the frontiers held against the constant pressure from the peoples beyond. As Constantine aged into his 60s, an advanced age for the ancient world, his health began to decline. By the year 336, it was clear that the emperor had not much longer to live. He was suffering from some illness, the exact nature of which is not recorded in sources with medical precision, but which left him increasingly weak and confined. Constantine prepared for his death in a manner befitting a Christian emperor. He traveled to Constantinople, the city he had created, though he would not die there. Instead, seeking healing at the hot springs near the city, he traveled to the suburb of Acheron, and when it became clear that he was dying, he moved to a villa in the nearby suburb of Nicomedia. It was here, on the 22nd day of May, in the year 337, that Constantine finally received the sacrament of baptism. He had delayed baptism throughout his life, a practice that was not uncommon among Christians of this period, who believed that baptism washed away all sins and therefore reasoned that receiving it near the end of life maximized its benefit. Constantine was baptized by Eusebius, the bishop of Nicomedia, not to be confused with the historian Eusebius of Caesarea. After receiving baptism, Constantine put aside the purple imperial robes he had worn throughout his life and dressed himself in white garments, the traditional clothing of the newly baptized. In these white robes, Constantine died at the age of approximately 65, having ruled as sole emperor for 13 years and having been associated with imperial power in various capacities for more than 3 decades. The news of Constantine's death spread throughout the empire, carried by the rapid communication systems that Constantine himself had maintained and improved. In Constantinople, in Rome, in the cities of Gaul and Britain, of Egypt and Syria, of Africa and Spain, people learned that the emperor who had transformed their world had passed from it. For Christians, Constantine's death was the loss of their great patron and protector, the emperor who had ended persecution and raised Christianity from a forbidden sect to a favored religion. For pagans, who still comprised the majority of the empire's population, despite Christianity's growth, Constantine's death perhaps brought hopes that his successors might reverse some of his religious policies, though such hopes would largely be disappointed as Constantine's sons and subsequent emperors continued and even intensified his support for Christianity. Constantine's body was transported back to Constantinople with great ceremony, carried in a golden sarcophagus as the funeral procession made its way through Thrace. In Constantinople, the body lay in state in the palace, and then Constantine was interred in the Church of the Holy Apostles, in a place of honor among memorials to the apostles, a positioning that expressed Constantine's own estimation of his significance in Christian history, and that was accepted by many in the church, though some were uncomfortable with the implication that Constantine was equivalent to the apostles themselves. The empire Constantine left behind was vastly different from the one into which he had been born some 6.5 decades earlier. The political structure had changed, with the tetrarchy replaced by dynastic succession, and the empire once again under a single ruler, though Constantine had divided it among his sons and nephews in his final arrangements. The empire's religious character had been transformed, with Christianity no longer persecuted but instead favored, its bishops influential, its churches rising in cities throughout the Roman world, though traditional polytheistic worship continued and would continue for generations. The empire had a new capital in the east, a city that would outlive Rome itself as an imperial center, that would continue as Constantinople for more than 1,100 years until its conquest by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, and that continues to this day as Istanbul, Turkey's largest city. Constantine's legacy would be debated and contested throughout the centuries that followed. To Christians, he was Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor, the ruler who had given the church freedom and imperial support, who had called councils and built churches, who had made Christianity a world religion capable of shaping civilizations. Later generations would sometimes portray him as a saint, with the Orthodox Church eventually canonizing both Constantine and his mother, Helena, celebrating their feast day each year. Medieval rulers throughout Europe would look to Constantine as a model of Christian kingship, claiming to imitate his example of using temporal power to support the church and spread the faith. But Constantine's legacy was not without its critics and complications. Some Christians, particularly in later Protestant traditions, would question whether Constantine's alliance of church and state had been beneficial or harmful, whether the church had gained or lost from its embrace of imperial power and worldly wealth. The very phrase Constantinian Christianity would come to be used by some as a term of criticism, denoting a church too closely identified with political power, too willing to compromise its prophetic voice for the sake of influence and privilege. Historians would debate Constantine's sincerity, questioning whether his conversion to Christianity was genuine or merely political calculation, whether his religious policies were motivated by conviction or by pragmatism. Some would point to his willingness to delay baptism until his deathbed, to his continued use of pagan imagery on his coins, to his involvement in theological disputes, where he sometimes supported positions later deemed heretical, as evidence that his Christianity was superficial or incomplete. The truth, as is so often the case with complex historical figures, lies somewhere in the middle of these extreme interpretations. Constantine was a man of his time, shaped by the late Roman world with its assumptions and values, its brutalities and its aspirations. He was a soldier and politician before he was a Christian, and he approached religious questions with the same calculated pragmatism he brought to military and administrative challenges. He was capable of great vision and also of terrible cruelty, of building churches and of murdering family members, of promoting Christian charity and of confiscating pagan temple treasures. He believed sincerely in the Christian God and also used Christianity as a political tool to unify his empire and legitimize his rule. These contradictions do not make Constantine hypocritical so much as human, a person trying to navigate the complex realities of power and faith, of tradition and innovation, of personal conviction and political necessity. What cannot be denied is the enormous impact Constantine had on the course of history. His decision to support Christianity fundamentally altered the trajectory of that religion, transforming it from a minority sect facing periodic persecution into the dominant faith of Europe and eventually of much of the world through European expansion. His founding of Constantinople created a city that would serve as a bridge between East and West, preserving classical Greek and Roman learning through the medieval period when much of Western Europe had descended into chaos, serving as a bulwark against invasions from the East, developing a distinctive Byzantine civilization that blended Hellenic, Roman, and Christian elements into something new and remarkable. His administrative and military reforms helped to stabilize the empire during a time of transition, buying time for Roman civilization to adapt to the changed circumstances of the late ancient world. The Roman Empire that Constantine ruled was already very different from the empire of Augustus or Trajan or Marcus Aurelius, those earlier emperors whose reigns are often celebrated as high points of Roman achievement. The 3rd century crisis had fundamentally changed Roman society, militarizing it, increasing the burden of taxation needed to support the armies, reducing the autonomy of cities and provincial elites, creating a more stratified society with less social mobility. Constantine both accelerated some of these changes and mitigated others. His reforms to the army and administration, his economic policies, his building projects, all had effects that rippled through society, affecting the lives of millions of people who never saw the emperor himself, but who lived under the structures and systems he created or modified. For the ordinary inhabitants of the empire, the farmers who worked the fields, the craftsmen in their workshops, the merchants in the marketplaces, the urban poor struggling to survive, Constantine's reign probably seemed like a period of relative stability after decades of chaos, but also a time of increasing burdens and decreasing freedoms. Taxation remained heavy to support the enlarged bureaucracy and military establishment. The government increasingly restricted people's freedom of movement and occupation, trying to ensure stable revenues by binding tenant farmers to the land they worked and requiring artisans to remain in their hereditary trades. The empire was evolving toward the more rigid social structures that would characterize the medieval period, and Constantine's reign represented an important stage in that evolution. For the Christian communities, Constantine's reign was a time of profound change and opportunity, but also of new challenges and temptations. The church that had developed under persecution had been relatively egalitarian, with leadership based on spiritual qualities rather than social status, with a strong sense of community and mutual support among believers who faced common dangers. But as Christianity gained imperial favor, as bishops became powerful political figures, as church buildings grew larger and more ornate, as clergy received special privileges and exemptions, the character of the church began to change. Wealth and worldly power became factors in church life in ways they had not been before. Theological disputes became entangled with political ambitions. The church that emerged from Constantine's reign was more powerful and more visible, but also more complicated, facing challenges from within as well as from without. The centuries following Constantine's death would see the continuation and intensification of the trends he had initiated. His sons who succeeded him would continue his religious policies, with some variations reflecting their own personalities and circumstances. Constantius II, who eventually outlived his brothers and ruled the entire empire, was a zealous Christian who banned pagan sacrifices and closed some temples, moving the empire further toward Christian dominance. But his reign also saw continued theological controversy as the Arian dispute flared up again, and Constantius supported positions that were ultimately rejected as heretical. Julian the Apostate, Constantine's nephew, who briefly reigned after Constantius, attempted to reverse Constantine's religious policies and restore the traditional pagan cults. But his early death ended this experiment, and subsequent emperors returned to Christian policies. The transformation of the Roman Empire into a Christian empire would continue over the following generations, with each emperor contributing to the process in his own way. Theodosius I, who reigned in the late 4th century, would take the final steps of making Christianity the official religion of the empire, banning pagan worship entirely and closing the pagan temples, including the ancient temple of Zeus at Olympia and the oracle at Delphi, ending religious traditions that had endured for more than 1,000 years. But it was Constantine who had begun this process, who had opened the door through which later emperors would walk. In the east, Constantine's city would continue to flourish and grow, becoming the center of a Byzantine civilization that preserved and developed the heritage of Greece and Rome, while also creating something distinctly new. The Byzantine Empire would endure for more than 1,000 years after Constantine's death, surviving the fall of the Western Empire, surviving waves of invasions and repeated sieges, maintaining continuity with the Roman past even as it developed its own character. Byzantine emperors would continue to rule from Constantinople, styling themselves as the successors of Constantine, maintaining his vision of a Christian empire, though adapted to changed circumstances. Byzantine Christianity would develop its own distinctive forms of worship and theology, its own traditions of iconography and liturgy, eventually splitting from Western Christianity in the Great Schism of 1054, but continuing to spread Orthodox Christianity throughout Eastern Europe and into Russia. In the West, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century, Constantine's example would continue to resonate. The medieval papacy would create the Donation of Constantine, a forged document that claimed Constantine had granted supreme temporal power to the Pope, using Constantine's name to legitimize papal political claims. Frankish kings like Charlemagne would model themselves on Constantine, seeking to combine Christian piety with imperial power. The Holy Roman Empire, which began with Charlemagne's coronation in 800 and continued in various forms until 1806, explicitly invoked the Constantinian legacy, claiming to be the continuation of Constantine's Christian Roman Empire in the West. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, Constantine remained a powerful symbolic figure, a model of what a Christian ruler should be, though different people drew different lessons from his example. Some emphasized his military victories and his defense of the Church against its enemies. Others focused on his role in calling councils and defining doctrine. Still others celebrated his building projects and his patronage of Christianity. The image of Constantine that developed in Christian tradition was often more idealized than the historical reality, overlooking the murders and the political calculations, emphasizing instead a narrative of miraculous conversion and dedicated service to the Christian cause. In our own time, Constantine remains a figure of interest and controversy. Modern historians have worked to understand him in the context of his own time, to see him as a product of late Roman culture rather than simply as a hero or villain. Archaeologists have excavated the remains of buildings he constructed, have studied the coins he minted, have tried to reconstruct the physical environment of his reign. Scholars of early Christianity have examined how his patronage affected the development of Christian theology and institutions, how the Church changed when it moved from the margins of society to its center. These scholarly efforts have produced a more nuanced and complicated picture of Constantine than the simple narratives of either hagiography or demonization, recognizing both his achievements and his failures, both his vision and his blindness. What we can say with confidence is that Constantine was one of those rare historical figures whose decisions fundamentally altered the course of human events, whose life marked a turning point, after which things could never be the same. The world before Constantine was a world where Christianity was one religion among many, where the ancient pagan traditions of Greece and Rome still dominated, where the idea of a Christian Roman Empire would have seemed absurd. The world after Constantine was a world on a path toward Christian dominance in Europe, toward the fusion of Roman political structures with Christian religious authority, toward a millennium and more of Christendom as the organizing principle of European civilization. Whatever we think of these developments, whether we celebrate them or regret them, whether we see them as progress or decline, we cannot deny that Constantine played a crucial role in bringing them about. And so, as the evening grows late and consciousness softly fades toward sleep, we leave Constantine at rest in his tomb in the Church of the Holy Apostles, in the city that bore his name, a city that would continue to carry his memory forward through the centuries, a monument more enduring than marble or bronze to the will and vision of the man who had transformed the Roman world, and through it shaped the future of Western civilization. His story is a reminder of how much can turn on the decisions of a single individual, how personal ambition and religious conviction, military prowess and political calculation all intermingle in the creation of historical change. It is a story of transformation, of endings and beginnings, of an ancient world giving way to a new one, of the death of one order and the birth of another. May these reflections on Constantine's long and consequential life carry you gently into peaceful rest, and may your sleep be deep and restorative.